You know, there are very few exceptions to this.
And
these are some of the authors of those programs, like the Jeffersons, like Fred Sanford and Son, and so forth. So what we have in black images on television is white people's images of what black people are or perhaps ought to be.
Which is a continuation of the minstrels.
Which is a continuation of the minstrel. And so we'll see it. Let's see what kind of images they like. They like images like this, Fred Sanford, like this, J.J. You remember how prominent J.J. was?
I think he's back on television again.
Is he back on?
He's back on. He has a family now, I think.
Yeah, okay. But he's doing the same things in all probability. Let's look at what happens as a consequence of that over time. Then African-American children, looking at the negative images of African people that are shown, cannot develop positive images of themselves. So then they seek images that are positive by looking at other people besides themselves.
Okay.
Okay. That was just a brief introduction. We could have done hours just on that part alone. And there's really a need to go into that kind of thing much more in detail.
But this is the part that you want to get to.
This is the part that I want to get to.
Okay.
But my wife told me that I had to put that other part in, or people wouldn't know why it was necessary for me to go into this part. Okay. The next section is a section that we call Africa as the Cradle of Humanity. And there's a need to talk about this because until recently there's been very little acknowledgement of the fact that the human family was a single human family. You know, a few years ago, 100 years or so ago, there were many theories about the fact that that human beings actually started separately in different places on the earth. That black people started in Africa, white people started in Europe, yellow people started in Asia.
Polycentric,
polygenetic theory. Many origins for human beings. Well, I think that's been pretty thoroughly discredited now, and as they began to search for what was called a monogenetic origin, or a single origin for all people, that there's really only one human family, and that's what I think almost everybody believes right now, that as they began to search for this one source of the human family, the chauvinism of the people who were doing the searching at the time, those who were searching were European, so they wanted this human family to originate in Europe, or they wanted its fullest development to be European. So they began to search in Europe for ancient fossil finds, ancient bones. Never really were able to go back very far. In fact, as far as they were ever able to go back was about 500,000 years. Then the search for this human ancestor shifted to Asia, and it was very intensive. The search could only go back to about 1 million years. And then this search shifted to Africa. They were looking in all these places at the same time, but they really wanted to find the oldest bones in Europe, and if not Europe, then Asia, and finally in Africa. And of course, Africa is now recognized by virtually everyone as the home of the human family. And it starts back about 5 million years ago. And Africa is not only the home of all the human types. There are 6 different human types that have been on the earth, and Africa is the home of all 6 of those types, and the earliest form of each of those types is found on the continent of Africa.
But once again, why were European scholars so bent on making Europe the place of origin of humanity?
They would be what you call Eurocentric. In other words, they wanted to elevate Europe, to claim all good things for Europe, and at that time the origin of man being in Europe could have been considered support for the theory of white supremacy or European supremacy.
Now, what time are we talking? What time period are we talking about?
We're talking about the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, during that period, but especially during the last 200 years. Okay, the National Geographic magazine is, I guess in 1985, November of 1985, that's when this particular issue was presented, contains the summary of the information that I was just giving you, and I will go through it very quickly. Today, Africa is recognized as the cradle of the human race. That's one line out of that article on early man in National Geographic. Skin color was probably dark, an evolutionary adaptation to the tropical sun.
Why is that?
Why was skin color dark? Well, biologists have a rule, an explanation that says that warm-blooded animals, like human beings, when they live in tropical climates, in humid tropical climates, develop pigmentation. They have a chemical called eumelanin, which is responsible, among other things, for skin color. And that dark skin color in the tropics protects you from the ultraviolet rays of the sun. So anyone who was not protected in that way generally wouldn't survive. For example, albinos can survive to a normal life in northern Europe. A normal life, there's really very little threat to their lives. But in the tropics, very few live beyond the age of 30. So because of the ultraviolet rays of the sun being damaging to people with that pigmentation. And until we had air conditioning and other forms of adjustment, it wasn't easy for populations not native to Africa to survive in Africa. But so that if you were guessing what the early African looked like, as people who study that do now, the archaeologists, paleontologists, biologists who are interested in ancient human beings, their best guess is that these ancient human beings had to be black people, just as the people of Africa today are.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, here is one of the human types. Remember I said there were 6 human types. There were 2 different types of Australopithecines, Australopithecus gracile, Australopithecus robustus, Homo habilis. And these 3 types that I've shown so far are found only on the continent of Africa. Nowhere else do they exist. Then we have the first one to leave the continent of Africa was Homo erectus, the one that I'm showing you now. Homo erectus left the continent of Africa approximately 1 million years ago. And we call this one Pithecanthropus erectus, if you've heard heard him talked about in school. Then there is Neanderthal. This one apparently left the continent of Africa somewhere around 500,000 years ago. But the oldest bones for Neanderthal are found on the African continent. This one is called Homo sapiens sapiens. This is the only one that's left out of the 6, and that's modern man. And so
who
also originated in Africa. Now there's some new information on modern man. For years, the best estimate as to how old modern man was in Africa was that modern man was approximately 100,000 years old in Africa. It turns out now that there are some people who are doing studies of mitochondrial DNA, which is genetic information in the human cell. And it turns out that there's 2 different types of DNA information generators. One is in the middle of the cell, or the nucleus of the cell. The other is in the tissue of the cell. That DNA that's in the tissue of the cell is carried only by the female. That allows scientists to study the evolution of different groups. And without going into all the technical details, which I don't understand, and it isn't necessary at this point, it is important to point out that in 3 different parts of the world, in London, I think it was at Oxford, at Emory University in Georgia, Atlanta, at Berkeley, California, at these 3 universities, independently, these scientists have studied through computer modeling backwards in time the origin of the human family. And they come up with a woman they call African Eve. And instead of 100,000 years old, this woman is 250,000 years old. That's the estimate. And it turns out that in their theory, one African woman is responsible, or at least is the direct ancestor of every human being on the face of the earth. Everybody who now lives traces their ancestry back to this one African woman. And the speculation about how she looked is that she would look like